Hi, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to the webinar. It is the 6th of August, 2015. This webinar actually addresses one of the most commonly asked questions, specifically, how do you decide the length of stay and who decides the length of stay and what's the process? What are the variables that help a therapist to recommend a length of stay? So I'll be talking about that, but I'll, of course, make it broader and talk about what I see as the stages of a child's, young adult or adolescent child's stay in progress at Evoke Therapy Program. So let's talk about that as we go through the stages, and let's make reference to at each stage how we're figuring out and looking at things and framing them in the context of the overall treatment plan. Obviously, I have to make it somewhat applicable to all families and all students, clients at Evoke Therapy Programs, because it's not one of those things that you can talk about every diagnosis and every client or student in the same way. So I'll talk about some general principles. The first thing I want to talk about is kind of your experience as Evoke begins. And the first thought that I always have is this idea, and it comes from my own experience as a client and also from my own experience as a therapist, is that the feelings you have after you place your child or your young adult child places themselves at Evoke is that things come in waves. Feelings of grief, sadness, relief, optimism, hope come and go. And so you don't pass through them. And I think it's important to know that, because I think we expect that when we go through some phase, some emotion, and then we revisit it, we have this imagining, this idea that we're stuck. And it's very typical and it's very normal for people to experience in that way. And you're going to feel feelings of sadness, feelings of loss, and feelings of grief. Although for many of you, these decisions were made out of a crisis or were made out of anger and frustration, oftentimes great fear and anxiety too, that once you place your child at Evoke, that it's normal to have those other kinds of feelings. And I think for a lot of families, getting past that, getting through that, getting to the place where you're starting to taste for yourself and to watch your child begin to taste the positive aspects, the benefits of the program, making it through those initial phases is very important. That's why we've included mentors as a part of the process, to be able to, from a parent to parent perspective, kind of hold your hand through those early phases, early difficult phases of the program. It's normal to have second thoughts. It's normal to wonder about it before and in between those difficult parts of the process. It's normal to have second thoughts and wonderings about it until you get to that phase, usually a few weeks to a month in, where you start to, again, see the benefits start to crop up in your life and in the life of your child. You start to really see how magical, fantastic the intervention is. It's okay to have complex feelings. It's okay to have both sadness that he or she is gone and also relief that he or she are gone. It's also okay to feel at peace. And a lot of people might feel guilty about that piece. I hear that from about one out of every four parents. They have an amount of guilt because they're feeling a relief or a sense of calmness in this process, and that's very normal to feel because your child is safe for the first time in life, first time in a long time for many of them, and in many ways, it's going to be the safest place for them, both emotionally and physically, that they'll ever be in their entire life. I think when these decisions are made out of anger, and that's okay. Anger allows us to act sometimes, right? But sometimes when it's made out of anger, I watch for that whiplash kind of effect. What happens when the anger subsides? What happens when it starts being that you miss them, right? You start focusing on all the good times and the sadness and the disconnection, and they're not in your daily life. And I think, again, that can be a very trying, difficult part of the process when that anger begins to subside or abate. Like I talked about, the peace and the relief that can often come from it can lead to guilt. And then sometimes siblings in the family feel it in droves because there's not the chaos, there's not the tension, the anxiety, the difficulty, the fighting, the conflict. And so that's a common emotion for a sibling to have. Take it a moment at a time. Take it a day at a time. I mean, that's the same coping skill that we invite your child to make use of. And so for you, for folks at home, breathe. Work on some assignments if that helps you. Read a book. Take care of yourself. Go out. Feed yourself emotionally, spiritually, psychologically in the process. Get support from peers in this process. That's an important stage in the program for a parent as they go through those early stages. I think a lot of parents struggle in those early phases with not knowing enough. I think, and most of you would agree, that the amount of communication we provide in the early days is unparalleled. That first day you get calls from the professional transporters if they were involved in the case. You get calls from our transporter or our admissions person letting you know that the child is safe. Then you get a phone call from a parent coordinator letting you know that they're at the office and their first initial impressions of them. You get that first call with the parent coordinator where they go over all of the information, and people talk about it like it's getting a drink of water from a fire hose. It's a lot of information. That's why we give you the printed material so that you can reflect back on it. And then, of course, you get the initial update from the therapist 24 to 48 hours in, and then you have potentially a phone call from your mentor, and then by the end of that week, somewhere in that first week, you're going to have the long phone call with your therapist. So that's a lot of information. But even given that, and there's the online portal, and there's the group journal that you get exposure to, and pictures that come out in the first week, even though you get all that, it still can be difficult not knowing because you're accustomed to being on edge. And there is some truth to the fact that if you weren't on edge, things wouldn't be safe. So it's hard to adjust to letting go to the process. And that can be, that's why we provide so much support in these initial stages of the program. So let's talk about the beginning stage for your child, what goes on for them, and really what we're trying to create. I think of it like setting up a play, choreographing a play, because I think there are distinct parts of the program that apply to all of our clients and students. So they're going to have exposure to the group, and the group makeup is always evolving, right? There are new students coming just about every week, and there are oftentimes new older aging students in the program leaving the program. And that creates a freshness to it. So even if that week one, the group is struggling, by week three, they might be thriving. And it's important for your child to be exposed to, with the level of supervision we have, challenges, both positive peer culture and also peers that are going to have negative influences. Because if we can't treat those negative influences in real time, we're really not providing you and your child with a great service. So there's going to be an ebb and flow in the process. There's going to be positives and negatives, and that's going to change over time. And it's going to be different for each student, meaning that some students are going to gravitate towards certain personalities. Early on in the program, right when they enter the program, your child is going to be presented a mentor. And they're really going to be looking up to the senior members of the group, their example. The cool thing about this is that students will talk about, I'll use the moniker Group 3. Students will say Group 3 is gone later on in the program, because Group 3 to them was when they were first in the program, those first few weeks, and all the people that they look up to. And it's hard for them to shift that vision that when they become one of the senior members of the group, that they are now somebody else's Group 3. So the mentoring process is a really critical piece of it. From that early mentor that's assigned the minute that your child walks into the program, to the mentoring that goes on through the impact letter and the early phase of the program with the more senior peers, letting them know, we were there. We know what it's like to first get here. And let me tell you what it's like right now. I don't love it. It's not fun all the time, but let me tell you what I'm starting to get out of the program. And then your child will get that same opportunity later on in the program in almost all cases. And we know that we learn more, we become more invested in something that we teach, and so there's a benefit all around. We start off in the first phase with a sort of grounding and a time for reflection. They don't interact with the group the first 2 to 7 days. They interact with one mentor and the staff, and they're observing. We don't want them to get lost early on in the social component of things. And we're looking for stability, right? The early stages of accountability are being sowed, if you will. And then we're starting to make an assessment. How do they react? Are they anxious? Are they agitated? Are they demonstrative in their behavior? Right? And oftentimes it's those first 2 weeks that we can't forget about later on in the program when they begin to thrive and make a lot of progress. That is how they cope. Right? Those early days tell us that when they feel vulnerable outside of the comfort zone, this is how they cope. It might be pleasing. Like I said, it might be oppositional. It might be a lot of self-punishment and negative talk. It might be giving up. It might be believing that they can't. So we pay attention to that. We're making early assessments and we share that with you. You're going to write an impact letter. And it can be difficult to write. It can be taxing. It can be emotional. It can be painful. There are new skills and tools. And I want to let you know that over the course of the program, and oftentimes in the early stages, there's oftentimes the necessity to write more than one tough letter. It's not an event that we just get to, but you can be asked to write different kinds of letters that are difficult for you, or difficult to say, or difficult to feel, or difficult to explore. So that idea of writing them again and again. It's important for you to be living your life. Yes, we want you to do the work. Yes, we want you to attend to the parent portal assignments. That's absolutely true. But it's critical that you take care of yourself. There's a huge shift in this process between your child taking care of you and you taking care of you. And what I mean by that is being responsible for your serenity, being responsible for your motivation, for your optimism, for your anxiety. We want to shift that responsibility from them being responsible for all of that and you being responsible for those elements or emotions in yourself. So it's important that you begin to practice to live your life. And I say for you and for them because it does benefit them when you start to take care of yourself, when you look for sources of support outside of them. They're not going to be able to verbalize that, but psychologically speaking, it's a necessity for an ideal or an environment that's striving to be ideal for the parent to learn to take care of themselves and not to require the child to take care of them. We want them to get better, but we don't want them to get better so you feel better. We want them to get better because they feel better. You know, we watch the old coping. I hear a lot of people in the early phase of the program really kind of verbally wringing their hands, right? Because they're worried because the things that we're describing in those first few weeks look and sound just like the behavior prior to evoke. But they need to go through that. We need to be able to treat it in real time, not by just reports or testing. We need to be able to treat it in real time. It gives us access to their pain, their trauma, their difficulty, their challenges. So the fact that they're demonstrating the kind of behavior in the first few weeks of the program is very normal. And we pay attention to it, we reflect it back, we explore it, we ask them to explore. That's part of the reflective process. But we're aware of and want you to be aware of that it's common for them to demonstrate all the kinds of things that they were doing prior to coming here. We watch for flight to health. You know, flight to health is a psychological phrase that is illustrated by the idea of I'm cured. I get it. I got it. A lot of clients and students will even say, this was a great intervention. This first week I've learned a lot. You got my attention. But one more week or one more day is a waste of time. So I need to get out of here. And they also think that the solution is a simple behavioral change. And while for many that's a great challenge or that's encouraging to see, we don't want just behavior change. We want to get at the root of it. You know, what is the root of the symptom? What's going on underneath? Because difficult things are going to happen to you going forward in your life. And how are you going to cope with those things? And what are they going to trigger for you? What are they going to echo? And what's your style of dealing with problems and challenges and feelings? So we don't want behavior change too quick. We don't want flight to health too quick. We challenge that. We're skeptical of it. We take a we'll see attitude. And we take and at least the attitude of, so why are you doing so well here when for days, weeks, months, with all the kinds of things your parents tried, it didn't work? That's an important thing for us to understand and for you to understand in the process. And we're patient. And a lot of students would say to their Evoke therapist by the end, like, oh my gosh, they could read minds. They were amazing. They could see through my nonsense, through my BS. And really what it is we're just patient and skeptical. We don't make a lot of decisions early on about what we think, what our conclusions are, what kind of progress they're making. And you have that luxury as a parent and as a wilderness therapist. You know, responses that are a lot of guilt, promises to change, threats toward you. I'm not going to love you. I'm not going to forgive you. When I turn 18, I'm leaving. I'm going to resent you. Apologies, and of course, early progress. Those are some of the things that we watch for the style. Watch for what they tell us about what's going on. Watch for when they start to do one of these things to me or to you, my response, my thought process is, so this worked for you back home, right? This is what you did when you got into a corner or when you felt threatened or when you just felt overwhelmed by things. So we talk about that. We watch for that. I like in all of my phone calls with parents, I set this up in the beginning. As I move toward the later stages of the program, I don't do it as much. But I always say, tell me your thoughts and reactions to the letter before I give you any of the report this week, before I give you my analysis of things. Because I want to hear what you're triggered by. And sometimes I'm surprised. Sometimes something that seems extraordinarily transparent, a parent is extraordinarily triggered by. And that's important information for me to know. It's important for me to see the dance. So I want that information before I start talking about my impressions, my analysis, my assessment, my observations. Watching how you get triggered or don't get triggered for that matter. Um, there are going to be times when we're going to become very directive, and there's going to be times when we want to hear what it would be like if you were just reacting naturally. And that's where we make intentional decisions around being directive and not directive. Um, I think as adults, we are impressed by and intoxicated by epiphanies. And for most of our clients and students, epiphanies don't come in a big bang. They don't come with fireworks. They come as the child slowly explores their pain, heals, looks at themselves, faces the things that they don't want to face in life. And that can only come with time and repetition and patience. So it's not about a big epiphany, although there can be some epiphanies along the way, of course. So who decides length of stay and how? At this phase, what I would say is we're not going to have much information. We can talk about where your child fits on the curve that we see, but in the first couple or few weeks, we're going to have very little opinion about length of stay and about overall objectives. That's not going to develop just yet. I think parents oftentimes are looking for it to fit in a box and be tied in a bow. Like, give me the answer. What is the problem? Right? And kind of tie it up for me. And it's complex, right? There are themes that we begin to talk about, but it's not one answer, right? Unless the answer were very general, like they struggle with their feelings or they're dealing with their pain by pushing people away. We can begin to talk about narratives and descriptives in that way. But it's not one thing. And it's not, it might give you a sense of relief or control to hear it described simply, but that's not the reality with most of our clients and students. Then I use this analogy of the big fish, and I think that's oftentimes a parent's early process, even a client's early process. You know, what is it? Is it the divorce? Is it the adoption? Is it that dad yelled a lot or mom yelled a lot? Right? Is it what is it that was the big T, the big trauma? And like I always say, borrowing from the adage of give somebody a fish and you feed them for a day, teach them how to fish, you feed them for a lifetime. We're focused on the process of teaching them how to feel. And yes, we're going to look under the typical rocks. We're going to go toward the good fishing holes that we know of. We're going to talk about mom and dad. We're going to talk about divorce. We're going to talk about adoption. We're going to talk about social traumas that we hear about. We're going to do all of that for sure. And we can be good fishermen and women at times. So we may tend to have ideas early on. But the fact of the matter is we're trying to teach them how to feel. And if we can introduce them, equip them with that process, and by feel I mean learn how to feel, learn how to cope with it, learn how to deal with it without symptoms, to mask it or to anesthetize it or to escape from it. If we can do that, provide that process for them, then they're going to walk away from Evoke with an enduring skill set, an enduring source. And some of it, it's not about the skills, it's about providing a safe container and just being with them while they feel. And so they develop a feeling muscle, if you will. It's like feeling exercise. So instead of teaching them, instead of discovering the thing, which it's not even really that important, we're going to help them learn how to discover the thing and things going forward. Because like I say, for many students and clients, the worst, most painful things haven't happened to them in life. It's not true of all of them. But for most of them, that's true. And so we want to equip them for that. So that's what and the early phase can be very dynamic, a lot of information, a lot of new assessments, a lot of examples, a lot of um, drawing from specific stories from the week and sharing those with you. So I think the beginning phase is very lively for everybody. Everybody's feeling a lot. Then I'll talk about stage two, the middle. When things start to settle down, when they start to settle in. I always say this is the most difficult phase for me to do the family work and the family phone calls because we're waiting for the work to set in. They've stabilized, they've become accustomed to being here, right? The sharp edges and the demonstrative behavior oftentimes has subsided. Maybe they're also just locked into a way of coping that is the old coping. And so it takes time. This is the time portion, right? And we can't shortcut it. I mean, I wish we could. Believe me, I wish we could do it a lot shorter. We would. But we can't. And it's important for you to be patient. There's times I said this, I wish I could skip the weekly updates because part of it is same as last week. Weeks, 3, 4, and 5, same as last week. A lot the same, more of the same. And we're responding this way. And we tried a few new things this week, but we're seeing the same kinds of behavior. So, and I think for the entire process of life, let alone evoke therapy programs, it's important for parents to practice during this stage stepping back and being patient and saying, I'm not going to waver on my commitment, my boundaries, my energy. I'm gonna turn that maybe inward about what I can do, but I'm not going to be controlled by you changing or not changing. I'm going to be controlled by or by my authenticity, by who I am, by what I feel, by what I'm learning, what I'm knowing. I'm going to be controlled by the things that I can control. I shouldn't say controlled by. I'm going to be influenced by, motivated by the things that I can control. Change during the middle phases of the program, like I said, it's slower, it's not as dynamic, it's not as interesting or informative. And so it's important for you to know that, to hear that, to know that it's a universal kind of thing. We're beginning to solidify the diagnosis, right? These patterns are now such that we can say, okay, this is the pattern of presentation. It's a depressed pattern, a dependent pattern, an anxious pattern, a pattern that's characterized by poor executive functioning, impulsivity, whatever it is, lack of empathy, self-harm, self-judgment, inflation of the ego. We're starting to gather together the data that's happened for the first half or more of the program and come up with a diagnosis. At this point in stage two, testing is often appropriate when the emotional regulation is moderated some, when we're not in that dynamic crisis mode or that incredible early phase, that exciting early phase. Testing oftentimes it can be appropriate. Ask your wilderness therapist about that. We want them to experience the futility of their old ways of coping. They need to experiment what works for them. And we need to watch that. We need to see that. I think early on, I think parents are paying a lot of attention to good letters and bad letters. And what I mean by that is the way that the child reacts becomes something that parents pay too much attention to in this early to middle phases of the program. I have a webinar called Writing Bad Letters. And what I mean by you're going to write the truth. But if you make the decision to judge your letter by the way your child reacts, you're really just engaged in a power struggle and control. So you make your decision based on authenticity, what resonates, what you're learning, what you're knowing. Right? That's how we make our decisions. And if it's honest and the intent is out of love, it's almost impossible to write a bad letter. If it's to try to change them or try to get a reaction, to try to get them to feel or think something, it's almost impossible to write a good letter. So we're talking about changing the way we're in relationship with our child, changing the way we think about our relationship with others, changing our relationship with ourselves. And I think this period can be a greater focus than the early. I used to say the early phase of the program, it's not about the family yet, although at this point in our evolution as a company, we have families doing a lot of work early on. But it's the early phase is about stabilizing the child, making that early assessment, and I think the second phase is about getting into the family work, not measuring your effectiveness by their initial responses. Um, the amount of directives at this point for your child is still going to be pretty high, and for you, it's going to fluctuate. It's going to fluctuate a little bit, but you're going to get more directives. This is the period where work really kicks in for you. This is the period where we start to consider visits and calls. We've done this on the parent portal where we ask you during this phase to ask your wilderness therapist about a visit and or a call. And we do that because we want you to know the intention, that we're being intentional. If we don't get asked about it and we're not inviting you out for a phone, inviting you to a phone call with your child or inviting you out to the field, we might not think to tell you, look, I considered it this week and I decided it wasn't best right now for your child. So if you ask us about it, that's why there's that prompt around week 3 or 4 to ask, even though that's too early for a visit. But you can begin to hear our thought process in the process. Why would we do a parent visit or phone call? Almost any reason except for one. And then that one would be not simply because people miss each other. We're sensitive to that, we're empathic toward that, but that's not why we do it. Ideally, we do it to do work. We do it to dig up some things that were going on at home that were a struggle. We did it to demonstrate the progress that's happening from one side or the other. We do it sometimes to set a boundary and a limit because sometimes your child needs to hear that in real time over the phone, even though you've done that in the letters. So there's a wide variety of reasons why we would consider it. Except for, like I said, if the only reason is because people are sad that they're missing each other, we're not going to do it for that unless there's that second reason to do it. When is it going to happen? In general, well, I'll say this. Every family, every set of parents is a candidate for a visit and a phone call. However, it doesn't mean that everyone is going to be recommended that they do that. And again, the therapist can talk to you about that. But oftentimes, if first phone calls on average are going to happen week 5 or 6, maybe right around there. And visits, if there's going to be 2 visits, a mid-program visit and an end-of-program visit, that visit might be week 6 or 7. Right? That's a typical time. And again, I'm saying typical because it can be before or after. And then oftentimes, with young adults, that might be the only visit. With some students, clients that are adolescents, that might be the only visit. There's an idea that we work with that says sometimes during the most vulnerable junctures of treatment, that is transport, it might not be best for everybody to do that visit. But we still want to begin to do work. Oftentimes, parent phone calls set up parent visits, but that doesn't have to be true. A parent visit can be the first bit of contact. And I'll tell you this, and I've been doing this long enough to say, we don't just want to create that climax of reuniting. Right? We know that that's climactic for a lot of families. And that's wonderful. And there's hugging and there's on the phone there's tears and I love it. That's wonderful. That's important. Right? That's the glue that keeps the family together. But it's not necessarily indicative of real life and treatment. Because real life and treatment is a Tuesday morning after you've been together a while. And that's why having the 2 visit process, the first one can be more climactic, or the first phone call can be rather climactic, rather exciting and emotional. But the second phone call, or if there is a second visit, is more like real life. So that's part of why we would do that, even in a short program like this. And then what is accomplished? Like I've discussed all the possibilities, and I've had parents come out for an hour. I've heard of parents coming out for 15 minutes to set a boundary. I've had parents come out that I've asked to step away or to leave because the child regresses to these old behaviors. And it's important to set a boundary. By the way, when parent visits are difficult like that, and I've said this many times, they oftentimes are the most critical, most important parts in treatment. So if you're asked to do an unusual kind of goal or to walk away or to leave earlier than you planned, if that happens, I would encourage you to take that opportunity because it has more impact in treatment many times than any other aspect. It's so powerful. But that's not what we think about all the time. Sometimes we want to get to some deep. Sometimes you're the most capable of pushing their buttons. Sometimes you're the most provocative. Sometimes we'll see something in person or on the phone in real time that we won't see with other people. And it's important to get you in for that. And then again, like I said, there are at times very specific agendas. Sometimes the work can be with one parent on one visit and another parent on another visit. So that can be a different part of it. It's so neat too because all of the clients and students get to see lots of other visits during the program. And they learn by proxy because we often learn by observing other people's work as much as we do from doing our own piece of work. So stage 3 ending, this isn't the end, but as things start to wrap up, we start to prepare for a reunion by having these phone calls. We start to make the box bigger, give them more exposure to you. Um, the family work becomes more active, more involved. Usually by this point, the rough edges are smoothed out. Usually by this point, they're not as demonstrative or impulsive. And so once we have that foundation, we can then begin to we can then begin to work on intimacy and connection and communication and listening. If it's volatile, if everybody's upregulated, upset, anxious, angry, right? You're not going to get a lot of work done often in those kinds of emotions. So once those have subsided and stabilized quite a bit, we can do more and more relationship work. We start to set the course of work for the rest of your life. We start to talk about it. This is something we know about your son or daughter. This is an accommodation academically that they're going to need. This is something they're going to need to advocate for themselves. This is a theme in the family. This is your trigger. This is what happens when you get afraid. This is what happens when he gets angry. So we're starting to talk about it and knowing that we accomplish some things. But if we accomplish anything, it's getting people ready to do the work for the rest of their life as a system, as a team. You are now working on, you're hearing about aftercare philosophies in the first two, and at this point you're beginning to get a list, make a choice about whatever the setting is going to be, whatever the program is going to be. And there can be intensive outpatient and wraparound at home. There can be residential treatment centers. There can be, which are more therapeutic. There can be therapeutic boarding schools, transitional programs, rehabs. It's all kinds of programs. Different kinds of academics and vocational training, different approaches dealing with different diagnoses. You can watch the webinar on Best Fit Aftercare if you want more information on that. But we're starting to get you ready, starting to get you a list. You're visiting and or making phone calls. And then you're narrowing that list down based on those interviews. And that information comes from most typically the relationship between the therapist at Evoke and your educational consultant or your home professional that you're working with. And then we start to talk about a transition date. And the transition date relates to the aftercare plans. If they're coming home, I have a different opinion about the length of stay. If you want to transport them, if that is a goal or a hope or a belief on my part that can happen, my transition date will change accordingly. Right? The age that they're at. If they're going to turn 18 and we want them in a program to have some time under their belt before they turn 18, that's going to change it too. So it's not like there is this objective date, this truth about when your child is done. It relates to other factors like the choices of aftercare and like what our goals, what our hopes are for the transition process. So that affects it. And that's why sometimes when we are asked, when do they leave or how do you decide when to leave? Then we say, well, we have a few questions, a few things. How are you on aftercare? Have you settled? Have you chosen it? There is a point of diminishing returns, but we don't approach it very often with our students or clients. Even when they start to complain, I'll talk about this at the bottom of the slide. I'll talk about it now. Even when they complain that it's monotonous at the end or they're bored at the end, my response is, that's kind of like life. That's kind of the thing that gets a lot of our adolescents and young adults into trouble, is that the pleasure-seeking part of their brain requires more stimulation. So what do they do when they start to feel relaxed, more comfortable, more at ease, less excited, How do they deal with that? So when they start to talk about that, and your therapist can talk about, hey, I think he's ready to go. I think this is a nice time. But when they start to talk about, that's not necessarily evidence that it's the time to leave. So that's an important piece of stay. And then we start to talk about length of stay. We start to talk about an ending date. I want to say this, and I might say this somewhere else in the slides. I don't remember if I do or not. But if you have logistical, practical, pragmatic needs that relate to length of stay, whether it be the schedule needs to be booked in advance, whether it be financial, we need to know about those because those are a part of the equation. And I'll tell you this, it's also okay to schedule a visit. I say this all the time. Schedule a visit based on some of your needs. And that visit can, at the time, you have to schedule it so far in advance because of your work schedule or vacations that are going on or other family members' activities or events. But you have to schedule it so far in advance that we don't know what it's going to be. We don't know if that visit on week 8 is going to be a transition visit where you transport them to the next program because we're making it at week 3 or 4. Or if that transition visit is going to be a visit where you come and go and then they transport themselves if they're young adult often, or we transport them in some cases with adolescents, or professional transport even can transport them if they're still volatile and struggling with the aftercare. So it's important to know that you can put out there your pragmatic needs to the therapist and say, can we work this out so that we can schedule it, and then we can decide later what that visit is going to mean and look like at that time. Level of care is definitely decided at this point. You know, it's rare, even when a child acts out late in the program. When I say child, I always mean young adult or adolescent. When a client or participant acts out later in the program. I said it to a student this week. We didn't learn anything new about you. We didn't. We knew that's what happened when you got stressed. We knew that's what happened when you got scared. It's not a lot of new data for us. And when we're not making assessments based on what you do, we're deciding, we're looking at what you do as evidence of who you are. And so it's not as, what's the word? It's not as dramatic for us as professionals as it might be for the child or the parent when something goes wonderfully well or horribly wrong. It's not that dramatic because we've already developed a model, and it would be very, very rare that even one of these aberrations, one of these strange, regressive, they stole again, right? Or they said or did something like before they came to a vote. It's not often that we're going to change our entire model or idea of the child. We might think, well, I thought we were farther along with that behavior, but I still knew that that was your proclivity. I still knew that that was there. And that's important. And I think even talking this way to you right now, I hope gives you a kind of patience and confidence in the process so that you're not holding on so tightly to every report, to every detail. It doesn't move that fast. Although it can look like it in wilderness, it doesn't move that fast. We have to figure out what needs to be accomplished prior to transition. Are we looking for buy-in? Are we looking for some more of the rough edges? Are we looking for them to go through various emotions in this process? Are we discussing choice with the adolescent in some cases? We discuss choice. We involve them more in the discussion. With young adults, it's a much more collaborative process. In the end, you get to set what boundaries you set, even with young adults. This is what I can support. And with adolescents, of course, you have the legal right to do it. But even in those cases with adolescents, it's okay to ask what they want and think they need. And have that inform you, as long as you run it through the parent filter. If you take it at face value, as a democratic vote, then we'll slow down. We'll say, wait a second, that's not necessarily the purpose. But it's okay to hear. And what does that tell you? What they're focusing on? What does that tell you what their priorities are at that point? What they're paying attention to? The box gets bigger at the end, right? More freedoms, more privileges. Because they've mastered some of the initial stages and some of the initial coping skills that they've been provided. They become more patient. And wilderness therapy is a relatively small box. And what that does is it provides a tremendous amount of security and safety, supervision, and support. And so as the box gets bigger, they're going to struggle. And that's okay. It's not necessarily regression. because it was there before. It's just that the box got bigger, so it shows up. We might call it regression, but it really is just being triggered by more choices, more opportunities. We're going to expand letters to siblings, to friends, to other family members, to boyfriends or girlfriends, even sometimes, in some cases, to those that were formerly negative influences. It can get that big because we want to say, where are you at? And so when we get those letters that go through parents, when we get those letters, we say, oh, this is so it sounds like the old stuff. Or how's that going to be in a relationship with somebody? You can't save your peers. They're not going to necessarily follow along with you in this new you. And I know you think you can change them and stay changed in the presence of the old context, but we're going to challenge that a little bit. It's going to be more daunting than you imagine. I always say that it's not ideal to discharge a child at the highest peak in the program. I want regression to occur in the field. Because wilderness therapy is so magical that if we discharge people at the peak and then they regressed afterwards, every parent would attribute that to the program. Evoke was better, and therapeutic boarding school or residential treatment or transitional program is not as good. It's not true, right? I love our program. I think we're wonderful. Obviously have a tremendous amount of pride for it and think it's a very intelligent, spiritual, sophisticated intervention. I believe all of that. But some of that regression is natural. Some of that regression is because in the beginning they were learning to juggle 3 balls, and then you hand them 4 more balls and they can't juggle anymore. They could still juggle 3 if they had to, but they can't juggle 7 because that's harder. Their skill of juggling, if you will, to continue the analogy, didn't go away. They just had more on their plate to deal with. So it's important for them to regress after they get to water phase or to air phase. It's important for them to do something old, and then we can work with them on the rebound and you on it, because parents become so focused on the progress that when there is regression, how do you cope? Do you get triggered? Do you regress? Do you go back? Do you relapse to old patterns, or do you take the new skill set and detach in a healthy way and just watch and get curious? So that's an important part for many. Not necessarily ideal to do it at the high. Then there's the transition phase, right? At this point, they oftentimes are introduced to more specific future information, right? There can be, at the end, various ways that we do it. You can come into the group overnight. You can come into the group for half a day. In the cases of some young adults, you don't come at all. Some adolescents, that's true too. Sometimes we bring several parents into a group and have a process and then take them out to their various stages. You can use the parent or family intensives as part of the transition if it happens to work clinically with your date. The next parent transition, by the way, is on August 21st. You can use the parent intensive in September to be a launching point. The other day, a therapist was telling me this actually today, that several of his students were commenting on the fact that the thing that they were most grateful for, impressed by, happy about, and this happened 3 visits in a row for him, is hearing how much work their parent did. Not because they're going to hold you hostage by that, but because they want to not be the only one on the journey. They don't want to be the only identified patient. They don't want to be the only sick one, the only one that's struggling, the only one that makes mistakes, the only human one. It feels safe when you do your work. It's inviting, it's welcoming, it's disarming. So the more that you can do, the more you can contribute to emotional safety. You will talk about transporting your child. You might have anxiety. It doesn't have to go perfectly. We do want point A to point B to occur, right? But when it gets messy, when the transport goes well, great. When the transport doesn't go well, great. Good is good and bad is good, because we learned something, and that's something you're going to be processing. And because families do well when they are apart, because the stress isn't there, and then reuniting can be stressful, it can be important for you to look at, oh, this is where I went back to. This is where he went back to. This is what I did when he did that. So transporting is something we'll talk about. We definitely won't make the recommendation that you transport them on your own if we feel that it's so volatile and likely that he or she will regress to the point that it'll become very difficult to make it successfully to wherever you're going next. So that's something that's important. You can have professionals do it. I used to talk about this a lot more. I haven't talked about this in a couple of years. We talk about something called soft transporting. It is a possibility. The soft transporter is a term that I made up that you can hire somebody from Evoke to come with you. They don't take supervision of your child, but you can hire somebody to transport with you. If you really want to do it, but you want the support, we don't do transports in that way. We won't take your child out of state, but we'll go with you or send somebody with you. And then you can set up that with the other person. And they can be a reminder to you, to your child, to use some of the skills. They can help you process along the point. I've done a couple in my life. Therapists often don't have time to do them, but some of the staff that know your child and have worked with your child might be willing to. So you can ask about that as a possibility. And again, you're going to have to contract with that person individually to do it, but we can provide you with some of those names if you're interested in that. You're going to want to make sure that you've completed the most recommended webinars and the webinars in your parent portal up to this point, because as you come out to the group, participate, re-engage with your child, there's going to be a foundation of skills and tools and language that he or she has that would be helpful for you also to have, so you can share language together. When you come for transition, by the way, next webinar is going to be all about transition. But I'm taking the time during this webinar to talk about it in one slide. Come to work. The parents who come to work walk away almost always very satisfied. The ones who come to celebrate oftentimes walk away disappointed, and during the process avoid difficult topics, feel extraordinarily disappointed when something doesn't go well, because they're so invested in it being warm and happy and connected. And while it can be some of those things, it's important to think about it. I'm coming to work. And work means I want to be closer, but being closer sometimes means that we have to bump around a little bit. We have to be coachable, right? We have to learn what it means to be in. I was doing a family session this week in the field, and the process was we were teaching people how to be in relationship with each other in a way that they had never been. Learning to listen without reacting and justifying and explaining and dismissing or rescuing, right? Learning to hear and see the other person. Learning to tolerate their anxiety. Learning to manage my own anxiety. Learning to not try to control. So, a lot of parents will say, "What do I do? What do I do if he or she says that?" My response to that is, put your mindset at evaluating more how you react to them than how they react. In other words, okay, so it may go well, they may say something regressive, they may sound or look like relapse, and that may or may not happen. But most important is, how am I going to do it differently than I have in the past? What skills have I developed to deal with? And you're not going to have to adjust to the positive, by the way, so that's why I'm talking about the negatives. But how am I going to do it differently? Like I said, messy is okay, bad is good, and good is good. It's all grist for the mill going forward. The mistakes that most children make are that they expect their parents to have changed. They try to manipulate. And sometimes that manipulation will be cloaked now beneath or behind skills. The example might be giving an I feel statement once to a parent about aftercare or about home is fine. It's appropriate. 2 times, forgivable. 3 times, it's manipulation. Why? I've heard you. What else are you asking for? Do you need me to change? Is the only way that I can prove to you that I hear you and understand you is to give you what you want. Because if that's the only way I can prove it to you, we're both in trouble. If I have to give you what you want and are asking for to prove to you that I've heard you, that I care about you, we're in trouble. The most mistakes that parents make, the most common mistake that parents make is they expect their child to like it and want it. They expect their child to not have feelings around it. You know, I tell this story from years ago where a grandmother met me at the truck as I was getting out of the truck to do the family session at our transition camp. And she said, it's falling apart. And I said, well, let's go have a session, talk about it. And what I found out, what I uncovered during the session was it hadn't really fallen apart. It's just that the young man was anxious about going to his school, his new school, and scared. And I said, "Well, did you berate them? Did you beg for it not to happen?" And grandmother said, "But how do we make him happy?" I said, "You don't make him happy. Just it's okay for him to be sad. Wouldn't you be sad? Excuse me. Wouldn't you be scared and anxious if you were going somewhere else that you didn't know about, that had very little information about?" So the most common mistakes that parents make is they have a hard time just dealing with not the behavior, but the feelings that the child has. It's okay if they sulk a little bit. It's okay if they shut down a little bit. It's okay if they're frustrated and scared and angry and disappointed. That after trying one more time to get you to take them home, your answer is still no. And you don't have to fix it. You don't have to control how they feel or what they think. You can have empathy for it, understand it. You don't have to justify or explain it out of them. You can just be there with them and hold your boundary and tolerate the empathic misery, as I call it, that you feel at the time. Um, those rough edges oftentimes get smoothed out. Um, like I said, in fact, I think that bullet point is from another slide, so forget that. All of those are from another slide. Um, the next step. This is important to prepare you ahead of it. It's important that you know this webinar was recorded on August 6th, 2015, so that when it happens, or if it happens to you, you know that it's not unique and that the explanations you get are not reactive or defensive or trying to dismiss it. The most common thing that a child will say that's difficult for a parent, and it happens a lot, is in the first few weeks of the new program, this is the wrong place, they tell you. These are the wrong people. I can do this at home. Even when they are, upon departure of Evoke, very committed, very accepting, even invested, you're going to hear that often. And that's okay. Breathe through it. Set the boundary. Make sure your comfort level with the therapist, with the referring professional that you're working with, make sure all of that is comfortable, and then breathe. And then wait. It's like at every transition, at every stage, there's this regressive experience where I'm going to try what works for me. I want to run away. I want to be anywhere but here. I don't want to deal with this. I want something else. Something outside of me is going to make me feel better. Give that to me. Sometimes there's a honeymoon phase in the initial phases, and then you get to this place. And so again, it's all about just breathing. If in an extreme circumstance you didn't feel comfortable with the school, make that decision slowly, as fast as you need to keep the child safe, but make it slowly and say, well, we're not going to go from there to home necessarily if they're at a school or program or transitional living. We're not going to go from there to home. We're going to go from there to somewhere else like that we feel comfortable with. That's another piece that I would say to parents. It's not the decision between therapeutic boarding school or home, transitional living or rehab or home, if you don't feel comfortable, if you really believe that it was the wrong place. It's the decision between this one or that one. So then you're not tempted and confused by the question, by the process. The box is even bigger, right? And you don't have as much support at most of these programs, by and large, that you did at Evoke. So it's going to feel a little bit more disconnected. It's a little bit more like real life. It's a little bit less quick moving, a little bit less dynamic. And you're going to be provided less communication and handholding because that's the stage it's at. It's normal to have that. And that can add to your anxiety, especially when you're getting these kinds of letters. Oftentimes in these programs, it's like the cement is setting in, right? It's going to go slower, right? Change is going to happen slower, but it takes time. It's a slow cook. Less communication is typical and normal. And grieving the loss of wilderness. Most students, even the ones that are eager to go, most students are sad to move on. As powerful an example and recent example as this, I'll share with you. I was out in the field in one of the groups with a young woman, adolescent young woman, who at times, many times in the program, threatened to hurt herself because she wanted to get out of the program. Many times. And then she found out yesterday that she was going home today. And she started crying. And she was scared. And she was sad. And she was grieving. So that's the job of adolescents and young adults, is to sometimes push. It's natural. It's part of developing identity. And there is a moving on. And we provide these webinars. We provide parent support groups, provide some things to keep you connected, to give you resources. But there is a letting go and a loss there. The next stage is more like life. And I've said, the juggling analogy. School is an additional piece. Work is an additional piece, right? Sometimes being in the community during part of it or a lot of it is an additional piece. And so just remind yourself that, and some of you know how to juggle 3 balls. I can juggle 3 balls, okay. I can't juggle 4 at all. So if you give me 2 more balls and I'm juggling 3, I'm going to drop them all of them. Not just the 2 you gave me, I'm going to drop all of them. And it's important to know that's a normal part of the process. And then there's this idea, and then it's the rest of your life. It's important, no matter what the trajectory is, no matter what the ebb and flow is, no matter what the progress and relapse and regression is, it's important that we adjust to the journey and not the destination. That we hold on more loosely. That we get off the roller coaster. That we learn to watch. That we learn to breathe. That we learn to adopt the mantra that it's too early to tell. Could be good, could be bad, too early to tell. Sometimes the worst things later on end up being the best things. If we can start to embrace the journey, if we can stop waiting to arrive, if we can stop getting too excited when it goes well, and too depressed or discouraged when it goes poorly, if we can start to adjust to that, if we can allow our bubble to be burst, so that we can be present and real and grounded, we can make an incredible contribution to our child's life. But all of that black and white thinking, that high and low, that high anxiety, that holding on tightly, that running everything through this kind of bipolar filter of depression and elation, if we can back away from that, we can really make a difference. Families in follow-up research who identify themselves as successful say that the number one adjustment that they made as a family is to stop thinking of things as good or bad, great or horrible, right? Stop looking at them in those simplistic black and white, polarized kinds of extremes. That's a really important adjustment that you make. And that's why in our parent groups, when I have some parents who have had multiple treatment struggles, and I have a brand new parent who's hopeful, I'm okay with that because it's important to adjust and to say, oh, this is it. Like my child has ADHD. My child is an addict. My child has bipolar and might for a long time, maybe ever. Right? I tend to be reactive. I tend to be fear-based. I have trauma that comes up in raising my child. I don't listen as well as I thought. These are going to be themes in my life. And if I can embrace that, if I can practice radical acceptance, if I can embrace the journey, if I can realize that happiness and joy and contentment and serenity is not ever in the destination, if I can realize I've already arrived, I'm already here, right? This is it. And it's okay, and I'm not off track. If I can realize all of that, I can make a huge difference in the life of my family and my child. And I also got to just say this one last thing. There are moments when I grasp this. There are moments when I hold this really well. And there are moments when I lose it. And that's okay too. That your compassion, to be complete, must include compassion toward you. It must. It's the only thing that gives you a chance to be able to look at the parts of yourself that you don't like. To get away from needing to be the good one, the right one. It's the only chance that you have. So I just wanted to speak a little bit about the journey and the rest of your life and allowing your bubble to be burst and having that be a healthy thing. All right, Stephanie, I'm happy to go over any topic questions. What would be seen as a good outcome at the end of time of Evoke, and what % of the students achieve that? Great question. I think oftentimes the behavior, the demonstrative behavior, whether it's directed inward or outward, meaning self-harming, self-sabotaging, or lashing out at others, is less frequent. It is fewer and farther in between. For me, it's about an attitude. It's about ownership. It's about I'll talk about for the child, and I'll talk about for the parent. For the child, it's about realizing I have an issue. I have some issues. I have some pain, I have some trauma, I have some ways of dealing with things that aren't always great. And the level of progress is going to vary. Like, I might have really made some strides, or I might have just made a couple of strides. But I know at the end of the day, I have some stuff. It's almost like if you know the 12 steps, the first step is recognizing you're powerless and your life is becoming unmanageable. It's almost like that stuff. It's almost like we're just trying to get a first step. And I have enough confidence that I can look at that and I can look at my humanness. And then maybe the depression abates significantly. Maybe I've added several tools and skills to emotional regulation, to anxiety that I didn't have before. Maybe I know that I can feel painful feelings and get through them. Maybe all those things. Maybe I become more motivated or bought into recovery, abstinence. Maybe I've made a commitment and accepted that I can't go back to my old boyfriend or my old stomping grounds. I can't go back to my old school. Maybe I have some acceptance around those areas. But if I were to make it very broad so that it applied to everybody, the best outcome is that I have issues to work on. And it's going to be a project. And what percentage of students, this is of course just for me, it's just off the top of my head, it's just intuitive, shooting from the hip, but I would say that happens in 90% of the cases, 80 to 90%. And the 10 to 20% it doesn't happen in, I hope it happens for the parent to realize we're not there yet. And I know what doesn't work. And I know where we're going. And I have hope and optimism. And part of that hope and optimism is born when the parent realizes I have to look at this different. My barriers to parenting are a problem that's a relationship with myself, my own history, my own parents, my own trauma, my own fear, my own anxieties, my own desire to control. So it's the same kind of outcome that I hope for, is when the parent says, I'm my project. I hope for the family system that there's differentiation, that the family has pulled apart enough to be able to see each other and connect to each other. Not react, not see the other person as a mirror, but to be able to see the other person and to know what's their work and what's my work. So those are some ideas about the big things that I see. Oftentimes, the demonstrative behavior might be the most simple example. The volatility is reduction is the most simple example to see. But then there's various levels of progress. But that idea of owning your project. We want you to all go to 6 of these while your child is with us, and don't wait until late in the program and then jam them in. Go to 6. We ask for 6 so that you can try out various ones. See how you feel comfortable. Get past the initial discomfort of it. Practice and model vulnerability of walking into a meeting, and you've asked your child to do that by sending them here. Please follow us on social media, folks. This is a way to also pay attention to announcements that you might not get some other way. You can also go to our blog. We have a really robust blog, and our Evoke employees are passionate about contributing to it. You can find my book on Amazon.com. You can also purchase it on Audible, through Amazon or on Audible, and for CD purchase. Any book on a subject of parenting or some of the issues, if you go to the Parent Alumni Foundation page and buy it there, it's the same cost as on the regular Amazon, but 10% goes toward a charity to help people who can't afford treatment. There's the parent meeting in LA, Los Angeles on the 18th. You can email 49jennifer@live.com. And we have Washington, D.C. coming up August 27th, 7 to 9. Stephanie's the one to get a hold of for that to RSVP. And then the New York City Marathon, the New York City Parent Support Group is set. And that is at the LaGuardia Courtyard. I'll be there for those. Both those. I'm also going to be introducing our new parent outreach person in New York, and so you'll all get to meet him there if you come to that. I'm going to try to see if he can come to the DC one also. Intensives and workshop. The Entrada, we want all parents that possibly can to come to the Entrada workshop. It's a 2-day psychoeducational experiential workshop. Parents rave about it. And then here's the family intensives that I'm going to be running. So if you want to come, talk to your Evoke therapist. You can combine it. You can come and do this. You can pull your child, if they're at Evoke Entrada, out of the field, do a family intensive, and then they can go back into the field. So that's something you can do. The parenting one, you can do that on the front end and then go into the group. That was a great way for many families to do it in the past. And then Finding You is for anybody. It could be on the topic of parenting, could be on the topic of any other issue, crisis, question that you have in life. It's a more general form, and it can also be for young adults. So I'll be running that in October. Pursuits is our high adventure program that can be set up as a customized, or we'll announce trips as they come. Go to our website for more information. All right. Any other questions, Stephanie, that came up that weren't related to the topic? No others. Thanks for joining us. Hope this point of contact is helpful. Even when the topic doesn't necessarily line up to exactly where you're at, because you might be done with the program, I hope that there are parenting principles that are helpful in this process. Next one, I'm on vacation next week, so I'll be gone all next week. On August 17th, I'm going to be talking about transition from Evoke and transitions in general, because that's probably one of the most anxiety provoking pieces for parents in the process. So I'll be talking about transition. So join me Monday, August 17th at 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time. Have a great week next week. Take care, and I'll see you on the other side. Bye bye.